welcome back to our discussion of the Great Depression and the New Deal. We have at this point covered the following information. We have talked about the long-term causes. Well, if this slide will move. We've talked about the long-term causes of the Great Depression. We talked about the election of 1928. We've talked about the stock market, how buying on margin was a problem, was a long-term cause. We mentioned the bull market that occurred during the 1920s. We've done the short-term cause of the Great Depression, which is Black Tuesday. Again, we looked at causes. We talked about how Hoover addressed the Great Depression, why he went with the idea of rugged individualism, why it might not have worked. We looked at the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which are the things that Hoover did, but again, very minimal government interference. We said what the bonus army was. We talked about the election of FDR. We mentioned the brain trust. We went over the impact of the revolution, from Hoovervilles to soup kitchens to breadline to the Dust Bowl, to the effect on families. And then we looked at the New Deal, the domestic program of FDR. We went over fireside chats. We talked that the New Deal focused on relief, recovery, and reform. During the first 100 days, they passed, or his administration passed more than 15 pieces of major legislation. And then we said that the idea behind the New Deal programs was the government was going to create jobs so that people could have a paycheck with which they would then spend that paycheck, which would create jobs in the private sector. And we said that the idea he was using deficit spending, but they had a plan for the government to pay back the spending. And then we focused on the bank holiday, the Glass-Steagall Act, the Federal Securities Act. And then in class, we've worked with the alphabet soup, the New Deal plans, so that you are familiar with them. And it's really important that you understand the concept or the theory behind the New Deal. How did he believe this was going to work? How did he believe, he being FDR and the Roosevelt administration, how that was going to make a change and an impact? So yeah, you need to know a couple of examples of relief agencies, recovery agencies and reform agencies. But again, we want to also focus on the bigger picture, that you understand the main concept. So we're going to finish up the look at the New Deal, and we're going to talk about some disagreements. So not everybody's happy with FDR's policy. Not everyone agrees with him. And I think you'll find that with all leaders, there are people that really agree with him, there are people that really disagree with him, and then sometimes there are people just in the middle that say, eh. And people that disagreed with FDR, and he is often accused, and you definitely want to note this and write this down, he is often accused of socialism or having the government take over certain industries. He is, again, often accused of being a socialist, having the government take over industries, and they specifically point to the Banking Act and the government investigating the banks to make sure the banks were sound so that they would be able to operate and prove that they were okay. Now, to be very clear, the United States has never, ever, 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 ever been socialist. Even though we have fears of it and both Red Scares, even though FDR is accused of it, our government has never nationalized an industry. It has never officially taken over anything. FDR was not, well, I can't claim he wasn't a socialist, but his policies, he was not a socialist. Officially, he was not a socialist. Maybe behind closed doors he wanted to be a socialist, but officially he's not a socialist. And people really disagree with the idea of deficit spending. Again, it's this concept that you saw with Herbert Hoover, that there's a slippery slope. So once you start deficit spending, is that a policy we want to continue? Is that a good idea? Is that something that we want to do? And once you do it once, then what's to say someone can't bring it up again and say that it's necessary to do? And there was a lot of fear that the government wouldn't be able to pay off that debt. And I commented that the U.S. has been in debt, that we've paid it off several times. But he doesn't pay back the debt that was accrued during the New Deal. That part of the plan did not work out. It's paid off, and that type of debt is addressed in the Eisenhower administration. So there are also two New Deal agencies the NIRA, or the National Industrial Recovery Act, also known as the NRA, the National Recovery Act, not related to the Rifle Association, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the argument for both of those was that both of those agencies overstepped the boundaries allowed by government, and that it gave the executive branch too much power, that it interfered with the system of checks and balances as set up in our framework of our government. And so the Supreme Court said that both of those were unconstitutional and they had to be gotten rid of. Well, FDR doesn't like this idea. He didn't like that concept. He was not a fan of it. And so he comes up with what is known as court packing. His idea was he wanted to increase the number of Supreme Court justices by 6. That would mean that he would name 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. Presidents want to name justices to the Supreme Court. Why? Because justices serve lifetime, or until they're ready to not be on there anymore. And it is a way for presidents to extend their legacy. While a president is limited to terms, obviously FDR wasn't, because that constitutional amendment wasn't made yet, but while presidents are limited to terms, oftentimes your Supreme Court appointees will go on far past your term, and it's a way to continue to have influence on legislation. It's extremely important, and you will see this in current events as well, where the number of Supreme Court judges and how many we have is a big deal, and the balance is very delicate. However, his proposal to increase the number of Supreme Court justices does not pass, and many accused him of wanting to unfairly increase executive power, and they saw him as sort of power hungry. While many people love FDR and they respect what he did to the Great Depression, that he stepped up with the New Deal, there are still critics of his policies. No one is without their critics. The second 100 days refers to the second 100 days. It starts in 1935. It builds off of the program set up in the first 100 days. The economy is doing better, but it's still not back to normal. And so, again, it was just an effort to continue to boost the economy. So Roosevelt is reelected in 1936, and we do really want to note this because up until the election of 1936, the African American population that was actually able to vote, so oftentimes we're excluding the South because of poll taxes, intimidation, literacy test, and grandfather clause. But African Americans that did register to vote tended to register and vote Republican. Republican being the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party that was anti-slavery. There wasn't a lot of benefit to vote for the Democrat Party because the Democrat Party was the one that wanted to keep you in slavery, and they were the ones that had wanted to keep you down. However, we really want to note that in 1936, as a whole, the majority of African Americans vote Democrat and not Republican, and that for the first time ever, labor unions give united support to a presidential candidate. And since 1936, African Americans as a general population both register and tend to vote Republican. That is such a lie. They tend to vote Democrat, not Republican. That trend starts in 36, and it has not ended. All right, help for farmers. So since the AAA was unconstitutional, the government creates the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. It pays farmers for cutting production and rewards farmers for practicing good soil techniques. To be fair, it's pretty much the same thing as the first AAA. They just reworded it to meet the confines of the Supreme Court ruling. So basically the same thing. The WPA was a way to just create as many jobs as humanly possible and as fast as possible. It did everything from building roads to airports to public buildings to sewing groups, and oftentimes on schools and libraries, sometimes you'll find a cornerstone that says that this was built as part of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration also worked to incorporate artists, musicians, writers. Again, I mentioned, I think in the previous one, that during as part of the WPA, people that had been journalists and writers were hired to go into areas of the Deep South and interview as many former slaves as they could find to record their slaves and what has become the National Archive of Slave Narratives. If you ever get a chance, it's all categorized by state. Pick a state and start reading. They're just unbelievable. And they wrote them in the vernacular, so the same way that the person speaking to them said it, that's how they wrote them. A very, very important part of our history that thankfully was recorded. The National Youth Administration, or the NYA, was created specifically for young Americans. It wanted to allow young Americans a way to get jobs, because oftentimes, and if you haven't found this out yet, you'll find it out later, that when you go to apply for a job, people want to know what experience you have, and then they don't want to hire you because you don't have experience. But how are you supposed to get experience if no one will hire you? And so this was a way to let those young people that had finished their education have a way to continue. It also provides financial aid to students, but you have to work part-time at school. Part of this is still going on. It's called work study. So you can get financial aid for college, but you must work a on-campus job in order to participate in the program. And oftentimes, some of the best on-campus jobs are reserved for people participating in a work study program. Definitely something to check out if you're in need of money for college. The Wagner Act allows collective bargaining for labor unions. So for labor unions to meet together, come up with general goals, and then go meet as a collective group. It's also known as the National Labor Relations Board. The Fair Labor Standards Act set the max work hours at 44 and the minimum wage at 25 cents. Hey. It also sets work rules for those under 16. So they're trying to combat child labor. They're trying to prevent workers from taking advantage of people in a desperate situation. Susie may be willing to work for 10 cents an hour, but is that really fair? The minimum wage now, I'm going to say is $7.50. I don't know, it may be $7.25. $7.25 is what I'm going with. It's a lot more than it was when I started working when I was 15. It sets the max work hours for 44 hours. Of course, all of this changes in the real world. If you're on salary, none of that necessarily counts. The one that you really want to make sure that you know the most is the National Security Act. This is considered one of the legacies of the New Deal, one of the legacies of the reform program. Because while all the recovery things will go away, the AAA, the CCC, the WPA, the NYA, those are all going to dissipate. The reforms, looking at the FDIC and changes to the stock market, those last. The Social Security Act was passed in 1935. It was designed to help those elderly people that had been very negatively impacted by the Great Depression. So your bank closes and you lost all your savings. You're 75 years old or 80 years old. You cannot get employment. What are you supposed to do? Now, Social Security was never designed to be your retirement plan. When people say, I can't live off my Social Security, you were never intended to live off your Social Security. It's designed to be a supplement to that which you have already saved. It is currently for retirees 65 and older, but as we have the baby boomers, that are those people born after World War II at the time, the largest generation, as they are now all living longer because of changes in healthcare, and as they are retiring, there is a strain on the Social Security program because Social Security is funded by taxpayers. So during your working career, you pay the Social Security tax. That money is paying for the current Social Security people and so on. So it's like you're paying into the system and then you're going to reap the reward later on. The issue that we're having now in 2019 is we have a lot less people working and more people receiving Social Security because they've reached retirement age, and it's draining it. Social Security is an issue that often comes up in elections because the system needs to be fixed. It is not going to last. And the reality of it is that my age in your age may not have that as an option. It may not be there when we hit retirement age. We can certainly expect the retirement age to increase as time goes on, because quite frankly, people are living longer, they're working longer. I'm sure you know people in their 70s that are still managing, that still work. Some of them are still in their career. Both of my parents are in their 70s. Both of them still work regular like jobs. So because they're healthy and can do it and they like to work. All right, so the unemployment compensation is there. That is, again, a temporary thing. You pay into that through your taxes while you are working, and then if something were to happen, your job was to close, surprisingly, or you were laid off, you will get unemployment compensation. It is not your full salary. It is a small percentage of your salary. It is designed to be in place until you get another job. It is not indefinite. And the amount of time that you can get unemployment compensation does depend, it does vary from state to state depending on the current state plan. There is a federal thing in place, but there's that as well. So that's there for people that, you know what, heck, life just happened. And life can be hard and it gives you unpredicted stuff, and we don't want to fault you for that. We want to help you make it while you go out and look for another job. It also is aid to families with dependent children and the disabled. So you may know someone that is disabled, they are unable to work, and they will receive Social Security money from the Social Security pool. Maybe you know someone that has a severe form of maybe cerebral palsy, or they have serious mental illness that prevents them from working. They will be able to receive that. Again, through no fault of your own, you are not able to work I'm going to say, quote unquote, a regular job. If you have dependent children, if you have a child that is born with severe disabilities that is going to need lifelong care, there is money for you to provide for that child, because it's not that kid's fault how they were born, and we want to make sure that they are receiving the proper and necessary medical care. So Social Security Act, we normally think of it as the thing for old people, but there are some other components to it. Definitely one of the major legacy and reforms of the New Deal. So the Roosevelt recessions. Interestingly enough, despite FDR's efforts, the Great Depression doesn't go away. It doesn't go away after the first term. It doesn't go away after the second term. The unemployment rate was 32% in 1932, and it decreases to 15% in 1937. And then there's an increase, and it's known as the Roosevelt recession. So things are going well, and then they go down. The reason for that is people are now having to pay Social Security out of their paycheck, so they're taking home less. So people begin conserving their pay a little bit more. The risk of spending and cutbacks. People, again, are afraid to spend that money because they're not making what they were. Keynesian economics, it's often referred to, it's become developed by John Keynes. Keynesian economics says that a little bit of debt is okay, deficit spending is okay, it's not bad. The truth. I wrote this in all caps, and I've said it a million times because someone on the test is still going to tell me that the Great Depression was solved by the New Deal. I hope it's not you, because you know better. So it is World War DOS that gets us out of the Great Depression. It solves the problem of unemployment and creates the domino effect. The other thing we want to be aware of is the truth of it is, for good, bad, whatever, the New Deal increases the national debt. It goes sky high, and we're not paying back that money as was intended by the writers of the New Deal. So critics of the New Deal, and there are a lot. So you want to make sure that you know Father Coughlin. He is a Catholic priest who has a radio show, and in his radio show he talks about the limitations of the New Deal and why the New Deal is not a good idea and why it shouldn't be there. He essentially accuses the New Deal of just really overstepping the boundaries. He's a Catholic priest, and eventually the Catholic Church says, Father Coughlin, we're going to need you to not say that on your radio show anymore. So you want to make sure that you write down his name, and it is Father Coughlin, Coughlin. The other well-known critic who actually accuses FDR of not doing enough. He says that you didn't do enough to solve the problem. There's still more that you can do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And his name is Huey Long. And he makes this promise to Americans of it's a chicken in every pot. And he says that that the government's not doing enough, and basically he suggests sort of what is socialism, that the government should give money to everyone, that they should play a role in making sure that there's an even distribution of money. He at one point ends up, oh, I don't have to pause, hold that thought. Okay, hopefully this is back. All right, so we're looking at critics of the New Deal. We were talking about Huey Long. He's from Louisiana. His plan is Every Man a King. It's the Share Our Wealth plan. It was really popular. However, he actually is assassinated in 1935 by a lone gunman, so he's not there anymore. The other one that you want to know of is Dr. Francis Townsend. He is a physician and a health officer out of Long Beach, California, and he said that Roosevelt wasn't doing enough to help the poor and the elderly, and so he came up with a pension plan that would give monthly benefits to all elderly, but the plan simply was just too expensive, and the Social Security is really an attempt to do what he was asking, just to a lesser degree. You also begin getting conservatives, I mentioned, that were against it, and the big name you need to know is the American Liberty League. The American Liberty League. It is led mainly by wealthy businessmen, also by Al Smith and John W. Davis. They were interesting Democratic presidential candidates, and the American Liberty League opposes the New Deal measures because they believe it violated respect for individual properties. These are the people that accused him of being socialist, of just expanding the powers of the government too much. And in reality, he had expanded the powers of the government more so than it had ever been expanded before. We said that the national debt got increased, and then there is this critic that the nation had created a case of the gimmies, that people now expected the government to solve every problem for them rather than solving the problem themselves. Sort of the same issue in fear that oh my goodness, that Herbert Hoover had. So that's going to end it for today. I would suggest that you bring your American Pageant book to class tomorrow. You probably will need it for the activity that we're doing. I hope you took diligent notes. I hope you have been reading either your American Pageant or your AMSCO, because there are things in the reading that I have not covered in lecture that I still expect you to know.